Imagine you're 18 years old, fresh out of high school, finally experiencing that freedom of college life. It's a Saturday night in May, and you've just come back from a fraternity party. You're in your dorm room, probably getting ready for bed, when someone knocks on your door. Maybe it's someone you met at the party. Maybe they seem harmless enough. You let them in. And in the next few hours, you'll experience unimaginable horror. What happened to Melissa Katie Autry on May 4th, 2003 at Western Kentucky University? And the question of who was really responsible has divided a community for over 20 years. Katie Autry was just 18 years old, a freshman at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, Kentucky. She was from Pellville, a tiny village in Kentucky, and had been raised in foster care by Jim and Shirley Inman. By all accounts, Katie was one of those people everyone loved. She had been a cheerleader in high school, known for having the biggest smile on the squad. Friends described her as sweet, kind, completely harmless. The type of person who wouldn't hurt anyone. Katie was trying to figure out her life, like any college freshman. She was enrolled in the dental program, working days at a smoothie shop and nights at a local strip club to make money. She was 5 foot. She was just living that typical messy, complicated, exciting college experience that so many of us remember. On the night of May 3rd, 2003, Katie went to a fraternity party at the Pi Kappa Alpha House on Western Kentucky's campus. It was a typical college party: drinking, music, people having fun. At this party there were two guys who weren't WKU students: Stephen Soules, a 20-year-old high school dropout from nearby Scottsville, and Lucas Goodram, a 21-year-old with a history of domestic violence and drug dealing, also from Scottsville. According to what would later come out in court, both men noticed Katie at the party. In the early morning hours of May 4th, between 2 and 4 a.m., Katie left the party and headed back to her dorm room in Hugh Poland Hall. What happened next would be one of the most brutal crimes in Kentucky's history. Katie somehow ended up with these two men in her dorm room. Whether they followed her, whether she invited them, whether she knew them, these details are still disputed. But what is absolutely clear from the evidence is that once they were in that room, Katie's nightmare began. What happened to Katie in that dorm room was absolutely horrific, and I need to warn you, the details are extremely graphic. Katie was raped, she was sodomized, she was beaten so severely that her left eye was swollen completely shut. She fought back. Witnesses would later say she was fighting, but there wasn't anything she could do. But the attackers weren't done. In what seems like an attempt to cover up the crime, or maybe just pure evil, they took cans of hairspray and sprayed it all over her body, on her breasts, her pubic area, her torso. Then they set her on fire. Think about that for a second. They set a living, breathing human being on fire and left her there to die in the flames. At around 4 a.m., the fire alarm in Katie's room went off. Firefighters and campus police rushed to Hugh Poland Hall. When they broke into the room, they found Katie still alive, but barely. The scene was nightmarish. Katie had 3rd and 4th degree burns covering her body from her neck to her knees. The burns were so severe on her groin that when she arrived at the emergency room, doctors had trouble inserting a catheter. One emergency room physician who treated Katie would later testify, "I thought basically she was already dead, but her heart was going." Katie was immediately transported to Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee. For 3 agonizing days, she clung to life. She was in a coma, her body fighting against injuries that were simply too severe. Her family rushed to be by her side, hoping somehow she'd pull through. But on May 7th, 2003, Katie Autry died from her injuries. She never regained consciousness. She never got to tell anyone what happened or who did this to her. The investigation moved quickly. Campus police and Kentucky State Police started interviewing everyone who'd been at that fraternity party. They were looking for anyone who might have seen Katie leave, anyone who might know who went with her. Pretty quickly, witnesses started mentioning two names, Stephen Soules and Lucas Goodram. Multiple people remembered seeing them at the party. Some witnesses said they saw the two men pay particular attention to Katie. There was testimony that they'd been drinking heavily. On May 11th, 2003, just a week after Katie's attack, both Stephen Soules and Lucas Goodram were arrested and charged with murder, rape, sodomy, arson, and robbery. The evidence against Stephen Soules was overwhelming. His DNA was found at the crime scene. Physical evidence placed him in Katie's room. When police interviewed him, his story kept changing. First, he claimed he'd had consensual sex with Katie. Then, when that story fell apart, he changed his tune completely. The evidence against Lucas Goodram was much more circumstantial. There was no DNA evidence linking him to the scene, no physical evidence placing him in that room. The only thing connecting Goodram to the crime was Stephen Soules' testimony, and that testimony would prove to be incredibly problematic. In interviews with police, Stephen Soules eventually confessed to being in Katie's room, but his story about what happened kept shifting. In his first version, he claimed he and Katie had consensual sex, and he left before anything bad happened. Then he changed his story. He told investigators that Lucas Goodram had raped Katie for over 30 minutes while Katie fought back desperately. He claimed that Goodram beat her, sodomized her, tried to suffocate her with a pillow, and then sprayed her with hairspray before setting her on fire. In this version, Soules claimed Goodram forced him to participate, forced him to rape Katie to help cover up what Goodram had done. When asked directly if he raped Katie, Soules said, "He wanted me to try to cover up what he had done." But here's where things get complicated. Soules' testimony was full of inconsistencies. He couldn't explain why Goodram would show up at Katie's room in the first place. He said he'd never heard Goodram talk about Katie before that night, and had no idea why Goodram came to her room. His timeline didn't always match the physical evidence. Details kept changing with each telling of the story. On March 23, 2004, about 10 months after Katie's murder, Stephen Soules made a deal with prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to 7 charges: first-degree murder, first-degree rape with serious physical injury, first-degree sodomy with serious physical injury, first-degree arson, first-degree robbery, and complicity charges. In exchange for his guilty plea and his agreement to testify against Lucas Goodram, prosecutors took the death penalty off the table. Soules received 6 life sentences, plus 20 years, all without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison, but he wouldn't be executed. The deal hinged on one thing. Soules had to testify against Goodram and claim that Goodram was the primary perpetrator, the one who actually committed the murder while Soules was forced to participate. Lucas Goodram maintained his innocence from the start. His story was completely different. He claimed he was never at Western Kentucky University that night at all. He said he went home to his parents' house in Scottsville, about 25 to 30 miles away from campus. And here's the thing, his parents backed up his story. Both his father, Mike Goodram, and his stepmother testified that Lucas came home around 2:50 a.m. and was there when the fire alarm went off around 4 a.m. The timeline would have made it virtually impossible for him to have been in Katie's room during the attack and then make it home. Goodram's father testified that he tried repeatedly to contact police after his son was arrested, to tell them Lucas was home at the time of the murder. But according to his testimony, police didn't return his calls until almost 2 months after the arrest. By then, the narrative had already been set. Goodram was the murderer. Soules was the accomplice. Lucas Goodram went on trial for capital murder in March 2005. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on Stephen Soules' testimony. They had no DNA evidence linking Goodram to the crime scene, no fingerprints, no physical evidence at all, just the word of a confessed murderer and rapist who had every reason to lie to save his own life. During the trial, Soules took the stand and repeated his claims that Goodram was the primary attacker. The jury saw videotapes of Souls' police interviews where he described the attack in graphic detail. They saw photos of Katie's burned body that brought jurors to tears. But the defense hammered away at the inconsistencies in Souls' story. They pointed out that Souls had changed his story multiple times. They emphasized that no physical evidence tied Goodram to the scene. They presented Goodram's alibi witnesses, his parents saying he was 30 miles away when the attack happened. The defense also highlighted problems with the police investigation. Captain Mike Dowell, the campus police investigations commander, had never contacted Goodram's alibi witnesses until very late in the investigation. There were questions about whether police had focused on Goodram simply because Souls pointed the finger at him, without doing the thorough investigative work to verify whether Goodram was actually involved. Lucas Goodram took the stand in his own defense. He maintained he didn't know Katie Autry, had only met her briefly at the party, and was nowhere near her dorm room that night. On March 21, 2005, after deliberating for only about 2.5 hours, the jury returned with their verdict: not guilty on all counts. Lucas Goodram was acquitted of murder, rape, sodomy, and arson. After spending 22 months in jail awaiting trial, he walked free. Goodram wiped away tears and hugged his attorneys. At a press conference surrounded by his family, he said, "I'm just happy justice has prevailed today. I'm happy to be out and be a free man and be here with my family." Katie's family left the courthouse in tears, devastated by the verdict. Her aunt, Virginia White, said, "I still feel like he was guilty." The prosecutor told reporters, "I think it's an unfortunate outcome. We can only present the facts we had." Jurors later explained their decision. One juror, David Austin, said, "Some of us felt in our hearts that he was guilty, but there was no way to prove it." Without physical evidence, relying solely on the testimony of Stephen Souls, a confessed rapist and murderer whose story kept changing, they couldn't convict beyond a reasonable doubt. Stephen Souls is currently serving his life sentence at North Point Training Center in Bergen, Kentucky. He will never be eligible for parole. He will die in prison for what he did to Katie Autry, or at least for what he admitted to doing. Lucas Goodram moved to Texas after his acquittal, where he worked on a ranch owned by his mother. In 2016, he had another run-in with the law when a woman accused him of stealing her cell phone and keys. A warrant was issued, but Goodram didn't show up for a hearing. The case was eventually dismissed in 2020 after the warrant remained unserved for over 4 years. In 2008, there was another tragedy connected to this case. Goodram's stepfather, William Bruce Dugas, was found dead in a burned-out car at a rest stop along Interstate 65. Police concluded his death was accidental, caused by smoke inhalation and thermal injury. But it added another dark chapter to the story surrounding the Goodram family. Katie's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Western Kentucky University, alleging the school didn't provide adequate security that could have prevented Katie's murder. Initially, in 2009, WKU was found negligent, and the Kentucky Board of Claims awarded $200,000 to Katie's estate. However, in 2007, the Kentucky Supreme Court had ruled that WKU was protected under sovereign immunity, creating a complex legal situation. The case did lead to changes in dorm security at WKU and universities across the country. The investigation revealed that the perpetrators had likely been let into Hugh Poland Hall by Katie herself, or had been snuck in somehow. After Katie's murder, WKU implemented stricter guest check-in policies requiring IDs to be left with desk clerks, and later added electronic door locks to take keys out of circulation. More than 20 years later, this case still haunts Bowling Green and divides the community. The central question remains: what really happened in that dorm room? Was Lucas Goodram really there as Stephen Souls claimed? Or was Souls acting alone and simply pinning the blame on an acquaintance to try to avoid the death penalty? The jury decided there wasn't enough evidence to prove Goodram's guilt, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was innocent. It just means the prosecution couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Many people in Bowling Green still believe Goodram got away with murder. Others believe justice was served and that an innocent man was freed. The truth is, unless Souls comes forward with a completely honest account, which seems unlikely given that he's already serving life in prison with nothing to gain, we may never know exactly what happened. What we do know is that Katie Autry suffered unimaginably. She was raped, beaten, and burned alive by at least one person, possibly two. She spent her final moments in agony, fighting for her life. She died 3 days later, without ever regaining consciousness, without ever getting to tell her story. In all the talk about trials and verdicts and legal technicalities, it's easy to forget that Katie Autry was a real person. She was 18 years old with her whole life ahead of her. She was working 2 jobs to pay for college. She was making friends, going to parties, figuring out who she was and who she wanted to be. Her foster parents, Jim and Shirley Inman, lost a daughter. Her biological mother, Donnie Autry, and her sister Lisa lost a family member. Her friends lost someone who lit up their lives with her smile. All of that was taken away in one horrific night of violence. The case also exposed deep issues about campus safety, about how universities protect their students, about the challenges of prosecuting cases where the only real witness is a confessed criminal whose testimony may or may not be reliable. The Katie Autry case is a tragedy in every sense of the word. A young woman was brutally murdered in what should have been a safe space, her own dorm room. One man is in prison for life for his role in the crime. Another man was acquitted and walks free, with many people believing he got away with murder. The book Cruel Heart by William Van Meter explores this case in depth, examining not just the crime, but also the community that was torn apart by it, the issues of race and class that swirled around the prosecution, and the questions that remain unanswered. Whether you believe Lucas Goodram was wrongly accused or that he escaped justice, one thing is certain. On May 4th, 2003, in a dorm room at Western Kentucky University, Katie Autry experienced horror that no one should ever have to endure. And somewhere, whether it's one person sitting in a Kentucky prison or 2 people walking around with this secret, someone knows exactly what happened in that room. Someone knows the complete truth about who killed Katie Autry. And Katie herself? She's frozen at 18 forever, remembered not for how she died, but hopefully for how she lived, with kindness, with that big smile, with a sweetness that everyone who knew her remembers. That's the Katie Autry who deserves to be remembered.